beginning the first part of our new series, No Compromise, Courageous Living in Turbulent Times. And it's all based from the book of Daniel. Now I want to begin this morning by just simply saying that I am a huge fan of the book of Daniel. When I was in my teenage years, sort of 17, 18 around there, I remember reading the book of Daniel through for the first time and comprehending what I was reading. It was just mind-blowing. About 4 years ago, I decided that for my main focus for the year was I was just going to simply sit in the book of Daniel. So I put all of my other devotional reading aside and I just went, you know what? For 2021 is the year of the book of Daniel, and I have to say, oh my goodness. It prodded me to then go on to the book of Ezekiel, but that's a whole other story. But, friends, we can't even begin to comprehend what it was like for these 4 teenage boys who were taken away into a foreign land. The number one thing for me that comes out of Daniel chapter 1, and I'm just going to lay it out there now, is it's all about stewardship. And it's all about the stewardship of our heart. When you look at what Daniel did and the way that he responded to things, he had actually given his circumstance some thought and he had prepared for it before it arrived. We live our lives where we look after property, we look after cars, we look after our finances, we look after all of these things, our families, our children, we are stewards of all of these things. But friends, the number one thing that we're called to be stewards of the most is our heart and our heart before God. And so this morning, there's going to be a flow on in this message back to our prayer wall. I mentioned last week that 2025 for us here at SAJ is a year of prayer. And so as I share this message this morning, there might be things sitting on top for you. Well, at the end of our time, there's going to be a chance for you to come and note them down and come and pin them to the prayer wall as an act of prayer. But also something that in a month or so up the track, we will have a half night of prayer where we will then pray for everything that's on that wall. So what's on top for you at the moment? Now, here we go. Did I get it right? I did. Hey, who's that guy? I know. I don't have grey hair there. No, that's right. Way back in 2010, 2011, and I've already shared this with some of you before, but I was called to be part of the Salvation Army response to the Christchurch earthquakes. And friends, for many people in that circumstance, their lives changed in an instant. There's a lesson for us, by the way. And you're going to go, why are you saying this, Matt? I say, well, behind our wall out here is State Highway 1 that runs down the Noronga Gorge that sits on a fault line. Friends, our lives can change in an instant as well. I just want to put that out there. But when I went to Christchurch, I was, in the early days, I was paired up with a group that would go from house to house and just check up on people. And there was a building inspector, an earthquake commission representative, and then there was me who was like the social assistance pastoral care type. And I noticed after day 1 there became this pattern. You would go to a house, you would meet the people at the house. Their number one question was, is my house safe? And so the building inspector would go and do his thing. The number 2 thing was then, what's the insurance process? And then the EQ guy would do his thing. And then, in my case, it wasn't the same with everyone, but for me, more often than not, the person would look at me and go, Salvation Army, why would God do this to me? Right? Now, as you can appreciate, the first two things are slightly easier for them to work through a process. And so I started lagging behind, right? And one funny thing that happened was I came out of a house. The other two guys were now 3 or 4 doors ahead. And the building inspector came out and said, "Hey, we need the God guy." Got another question, right? And I always found that interesting because you just had this massive, massive event that happens. And the default question for people then becomes, why would God do this to me? Why would God let this happen? Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if you've kind of looked at the news of recent times. There's some pretty horrific stuff that's going on in the world at the moment. I see over the weekend there was a mass shooting in Sweden. For those of you that are following the news in Greece, I see within about a 48-hour period there were over 500 earthquakes in Greece. If I mention the words Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, China, and a certain US election, these can all evoke feelings of uncertainty in people. I was reading on wallstreet.com this morning that there are, as we sit here this morning, there are currently 13 major global wars happening right now. And according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, there are currently over 100 million people currently displaced because of war, persecution, violence, and human rights violations. And what I've mentioned here, people, is only a small snippet of what's going on. So for us as Christ followers, when we look at all of this, it becomes a question of sovereignty, especially as so much that happens to us in life is outside of our control. The only thing that we have control over is the way in which we respond to things. So now, this is one of the key themes of the book of Daniel. It's the sovereignty of God. And when we talk about the sovereignty of God, it's really to ask the question, where is God in the midst of all of this? And as Christ followers, we have to be so careful that when we look at the state of the world, that we don't get discouraged, that we don't lose our identity in the midst of everything that's going on. You see, friends, Jesus calls us to be salt and light to a world that is in darkness. But a question that I have for all of us is, how do we make sure that we don't not lose our light in the moment that we're called to shine? Now, about 2,500 years ago, Daniel could have despaired. He and thousands of his people had been taken away in slavery. They were deported to a foreign land after Judea was conquered. Daniel was taken away to a foreign land. He was put before this king who was actually, when you break it down, he was a bit of a despot. He was surrounded by idolatry everywhere. And we see that Daniel does this interesting thing in chapter 1 where he resolves in his heart not to compromise. He had already given this some pre-thought. He held fast to his faith in God, and he knew that despite the circumstances, God was sovereign, and he was working out his plan for nations and for individuals. And because he knew that God was sovereign, friends, one of the things that we're going to discover as we go through Daniel is that he was a man of deep prayer. Friends, anytime that you ask the question, you might look at the news and you ask the question, where is God in all of this? If you personalize that language and say, God, where are you in all of this? Guess what? You've just entered into prayer. As a side note, I think that Daniel had a different default question. Instead of, God, where are you in all of this? I think his thinking is, God, what are you up to? And how can I team up with you? That's how I think Daniel operated. So when we look at the times of Daniel and we look at the world today, it was actually very similar. People were displaced, wars were everywhere, nations were rising and falling. There's nothing new under the sun. Now, before we get into the text, I want to give you, and I've practiced this, so hopefully it's like a 2-minute synopsis as to what was going on globally in the world at the time. And some of you will find this fascinating. For some of you, it will be like watching grass grow or waiting for the jug to boil or watching paint dry, right? But just bear with me because it lays a platform as to the world that Daniel was in. Now, when you read your Bible and you get to a certain point, Israel, who had not been keeping God's covenant, effectively had a big civil war. And the nation was divided into the northern kingdom, which became known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was known as Judah. The Assyrian Empire, in around 722 BC, God was fed up with the northern kingdom, and effectively Assyria wiped them out. Okay. Then, in the southern kingdom, God used the Babylonian Empire to effectively take them away into captivity. Now you'll notice there's about 120 years difference in those dates. Then, in Assyria, in the northern kingdom, they had 2 key cities. They had a city called Nineveh. Now last year, we did a series on Jonah, and this was the city that Jonah was called to take a message of repentance to. Remember the fish god and all that kind of stuff. Well, this was the Assyrian capital. They had another city called Haran. And in 612 BC, the Medes and the Scythians, they conquered Nineveh. And the leader at the time, he relocated the capital to Haran. So everything was in a bit of chaos for the Assyrians. The Assyrians, their leader at the time, he sends out an SOS to Egypt. And Egypt was under a binding agreement that they had to come and help out the Assyrian Empire, right? So effectively, in a nutshell, the Assyrians were the bad boys on the block, big boys, but things were not going well for them. And other nations were slowly beginning to erode the empire. We go to Egypt. Egypt get the message. Now remember, this is the ancient world, right? So unlike us, we'd make a phone call, things could happen within 24 hours. You've got to remember that this probably took 6-8 months, a year. Okay, by the time the message gets there, Egypt assembles her troops and then responds. And a guy called Pharaoh Necho II, he deploys all of his troops to come and help Assyria. The only problem is that on his way, he runs into this guy called King Josiah. And King Josiah you can read about in the book of 2 Kings. But God told Josiah to assemble his troops and to go out and meet Egypt. And it's a very interesting thing that happens because for Josiah it goes wrong and it costs him his life. And there was a famous battle called the Battle of Megiddo. King Josiah was killed, and Pharaoh Necho, what happened was it delayed him getting to help the Assyrians. Now, meanwhile, back in Assyria, the Medes and the Scythians, they had then taken out the second capital, Haran, and Assyria was in big trouble. When Pharaoh Necho arrives, he comes to the city of Carchemish because they couldn't go to the Assyrian cities, and met all of the surviving Assyrian troops. And what they do is they try a one-off offensive. They get everyone together and they try to recapture Haran, and it doesn't work. And they fall back again to Carchemish. Now, you go, what is the point of all this? The cool thing is, in the shadows, there had been waiting our key character from the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar II, had been waiting for all of these things to play out. So how you become the boss or the big boy is you wait for all the other boys to finish their fighting. And then you step in and you go, hey. And that's exactly what he did. And so Egypt and Assyria were the two main enemies of Babylon, and he had them all in the one place. And it led to a particular battle, famous battle called the Battle of Carchemish. And Nebuchadnezzar leveled the lot of them. He was brutal. He was not a nice guy. But he knew from a geopolitical perspective, this was going to change the world. And effectively, through that one battle, the Assyrian Empire ended. Egypt never recovered. This was known as the beginning of the decline of Egypt. Babylon was now, overnight, the new world empire. Now, Jehoiakim, who we met in chapter 1, had been, in his spare time, egging on Babylon, right? Not a good move. And so, on his way home, he goes, right, we're now going to call past Jerusalem because we need to deal to this guy who we meet in chapter 1. And what happens effectively, this is, if all of this is a bit of a haze to you, don't worry about it. It's this part here that's the important part. Nebuchadnezzar comes and he begins effectively a 3-stage process. It was actually 3 deportations of people that happened from Jerusalem. And this happened in about 605 BC was the first one. And effectively, in the first deportation, he comes and he removes the king and he puts his own person in charge, right? Puts his own dude. And then he takes between 7,000 and 10,000 people in chains to Babylon. Now, I find it amazing that within all of the chaos that was going on globally, God didn't send an army. God sent 4 teenage boys, right? So in the first deportation, Daniel and his friends are taken in chains to Babylon, and this is where the story picks up today. However, the new guy that Nebuchadnezzar put in place, he steps out of line, and effectively he's listening to all of this bad advice, and he's saying, yes, we're God's chosen people. The Babylonians aren't going to last, so, stick it to the Babylonians. So anyway, Nebuchadnezzar's the wrong dude to do that with, and he returns. And here we go. Jeremiah turns up about this time in Jerusalem. So when you read the book of Jeremiah and everything's going wrong, it's because Jeremiah is going to the king, the installed king, and saying, don't rebel against Babylon. Babylon is God's chosen instrument for the season. And of course, he gets imprisoned and all sorts of things happen to him. Nebuchadnezzar returns. Then there's a second deportation where he removes that guy and he puts in a new guy. And in the second deportation, there's a guy called Ezekiel who he's taken away in chains to Babylon. And so just so that when you read your Bible, you'll see that there's Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of Daniel all together. It's because they were contemporaries, okay? But they were just having a bad time of everything. And Ezekiel, when you look at the visions and prophetic dreams that Ezekiel had, a lot of it had to do for when Nebuchadnezzar would turn up again, because the new king stepped out of line, and by the third time, Nebuchadnezzar had had a bellyful, and he levels the place. And he takes all of some people into slavery, puts a whole lot of people to death, and then he leaves a few remaining people who he considered to be weak in the area, but who could never rebuild what was going on. Now, from a prophetic perspective, you have to ask the question, why did God send his people into captivity? The first one was this, is that Israel had forgotten her covenant with, or her agreement with God. Israel had forgotten, actually, that we're God's people, or had assumed they were God's people but could live the way that they wanted, and that's just not how it works. And one of the things that Israel hadn't done was that Israel had not kept the Sabbath for around 490 years, right? And that's outlined in 2 Chronicles. And so this equaled 70 years of captivity. Friends, the amazing thing about this book is that they were in captivity for 70 years to the day. It amazes me how the details were so precise. Now, I've put there Matthew 18:22. There's a famous question that Jesus gets asked in that passage, and it's how many times should I forgive? And some of you will know that. Well, it's 70 times 7. Friends, what is 70 times 7 mathematically? 490. Okay? Israel hadn't kept the Sabbath for 490 years, and God forgave them. There's this amazing New Testament reference back to this if we understand our maths well. So, there's two prophetic terminology phrases, if you like, that I'm going to introduce you to. That's not for today, but I'm just going to flag them. The first one, at the first deportation, a 70-year clock began that fulfilled something prophetically called the servitude of the nations. And this was from the moment that they were taken into captivity to the moment that they were released was 70 years exactly. Now, another interesting thing happens. At the third deportation, when Nebuchadnezzar comes up and levels the place, it was 70 years exactly from that moment until another decree happened that the Israelites could go back and rebuild Jerusalem. 70 years to the day. And the prophetic geniuses, I like to call them, they call it the 70 years desolations of Jerusalem begins. But friends, what is the purpose of Sabbath? The purpose of Sabbath is rest. And what was happening to the land of Israel during that 70 years? It was lying fallow. It was resting. It's like God goes, you haven't kept the Sabbaths for 490 years. Guess what, guys? You owe me 70. That's the way that I kind of interpret it. So that's the background into, here's the ugly guy again, the background into Daniel's situation. Now, I know some of you are sick of me saying, I went to the British Museum, but hey, I went to the British Museum. In the British Museum, there's this amazing artifact called the Black Obelisk. And the Black Obelisk depicts King Jehu of the Northern Kingdom paying tribute to Assyria. In fact, he was kissing the feet of the king. This was just before Assyria wiped out the Northern Kingdom. Then, a lot of what I've talked about, Nebuchadnezzar himself wrote down in one of his clay tablets. And the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle from the British Museum refers to the victory at Carchemish and also describes the second siege of Jerusalem. So, friends, a lot of what I'm talking about here is authenticated through artifacts and things like that, and I find that interesting, and I've only scratched the surface, but I'm not going to bore everyone with that. So, to our text, Daniel chapter 1. Let's read this, couple of key thoughts, and then we'll have a response time. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. I always love that wording. Like, how did Nebuchadnezzar win? Oh, he won because God ordained it. God delivered them into his hand. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. It's interesting that there's the word, some of the articles. Nebuchadnezzar did not get all of the articles. And the thinking was that by this stage, this thing called the Ark of the Covenant had already disappeared in one sense. But we know from history that he returns a lot of them to Jerusalem, or the way that things play out at a later date under a guy called Zerubbabel. Then he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, or some of your texts will say the land of Shinar, and he put them in the treasure house of his God. Shinar, I just want to put it out there. People say all of this different. Shinar, Shinar, Sheena, I've heard it all. But whenever you see that word, it turns up 7 times in the Old Testament, and it always refers to the province of Babylon. So Babylon is the city, but Shinar is the rest of Babylon, if that makes sense. That, by the way, is in modern-day Iraq. Now, something that is really interesting to do is at some point, not now, but go on Google Maps and put in ancient Babylon. And it will take you to ancient Babylon, and you will see Nebuchadnezzar's palace. You will see the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the site. You will see the Tower of Babel site. It's all there, right? I was looking at it yesterday, going, haven't looked at it for a while. Before I say this today, better make sure it's still there. But it's a really interesting thing to do. It's splattered amongst sports clubs and car parks and malls, right? It's how the world changes is quite interesting. Verse 3, then the king, that's Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Some of your texts will say the Chaldeans. So this is a very enlightened technique, right? Bring your captives in, look for the bright ones, train them, kind of in a degree type program. And after about 3 years, there was the hope that they would then bring all of their experience into the service of the king. Then he would question them and would find an appropriate place in his administration for them to be useful. However, as we see in the text, right, and this is where I think it really starts to get interesting, is that they needed to become Babylonian in the process. Their identity needed to be stripped away, and it needed to be replaced. There was some reprogramming that needed to take place. Now, just a reminder, these guys at this point, they're aged between 14 and 16. They're teenagers. We often see pictures of Daniel on the lion's den as this old guy, right? And that's true. But actually, at the beginning, they were teenagers. And can you imagine how their lives had just been turned upside down? They were, by the way, from the royal family in Judah. People just think often, oh, they are these random guys. No, they were royalty in Israel. While they'd all been well taught, they were snatched away and led away in chains to a foreign country that they would never see Jerusalem again. So you talk about your life changing overnight. We also learnt that they were handsome. They were very well liked by everyone. So much so that this caught their captives' attention in Babylon. So what was it about them that attracted their attention? Now, I just want to put it out there, friends, that the Babylonian culture was ahead of its time scientifically. The reason that we have 360 degrees in a circle, the reason that we have 60 minutes to an hour, and 60 seconds in a minute comes from the sexagesimal system, which was based on like a base 60 system, invented in the ancient empires of Sumeria and Babylon. The astronomy in Babylon was ahead of its time. And from their astronomy, we get a whole lot of religious and astrological ideas today. Ladies, the zodiac signs you see in the ladies' magazines, that goes back to ancient Babylon, right? Anyway, the text continues. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. So just notice, this is not barracks rations, right? They were eating from the king's menu. They're being treated really well for captives. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Some of your texts will say they had to stand before the king. So the training was with the intent that they'd be tested by the king himself, who would then, if they passed, determine the type of service that they would be assigned to. Verse 6. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. Who remembers the song? Yeah. But it's using the wrong names. Just putting it out there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, the reason I say it's the wrong names is because when you learn the meanings of those names, it's actually quite startling. Daniel means, in the Hebrew, God is my judge. Hananiah means, beloved of the Lord. Mishael means, who is as God. And Azariah means, the Lord is my help. You see, these Hebrew boys all had good, godly names, as you would expect from the Hebrew culture, right? But then the reprogramming begins. Daniel gets renamed Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar means the prince of the sun god Bel. By the way, there's Belteshazzar, who's the name of Daniel, and another guy called Belshazzar turns up later in the book. Don't get them confused. Daniel has the T. That's what you get. The letter T is in there. Hananiah gets renamed Shadrach, and Shadrach means illuminated by the sun god. Mishael gets renamed Meshach, and Meshach means who is like the moon god, right? And actually this moon god would ultimately become what we would know today as the Islamic god. Azariah gets renamed Abednego, and Abednego means the servant of Nago, or servant of the shining fire. Now, the startling thing about this one is in the Chaldean, it can transfer literally to mean Lucifer, the shining one. So friends, can you imagine being taken into that place, and guess what, Mike? You've got a new name. Your new name is now Lucifer. You know what I mean? We think, and they're taking it serious. That's actually quite right out there. But the whole idea is to change their identity and their destiny, to change their identity from being God's children to become the children of Babylon, and to change their destiny away from Jerusalem but to Babylon. And both of these attempted changes would be reinforced by the constant use of your new name. But here's the good news. We pick up the text again in verse 8. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food. He resolved in his heart, I'm not going to let any of this get to me, right? Some of your versions will say meat. Some of your texts will say unacceptable food. Now, friends, please understand that there's nothing wrong with eating meat, right? Because you'll jump on the internet and you say, oh, there's the Daniel diet. My hunch is that this was a diet that they were trying to enforce on Daniel, right? There's nothing wrong with eating meat. That's not the point here. The reason that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with this food, was because, firstly, as a part of the preparation process, it had been offered to idols. The second thing was that some of the food would have been prohibited under the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law. And so it was technically ceremonially unclean. So the text is not an argument to become a vegetarian or a vegan. And while these things might be helpful, it's actually not what the text is getting at. The idea, friends, of meat being offered to an idol was completely offensive to a Jew. And in the Babylonian practice, it was the meat that was offered, not the vegetables. Okay? So Daniel resolves within himself to try and get around this problem. And how does he do it? Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. So notice, before he makes this request, he's already got the affection and respect of his boss. I think sometimes the way in which people protest in our society, they can learn a lot from this. Verse 10, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned me your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. And by the way, this guy really had to be nervous, because Nebuchadnezzar was a bit of, as I mentioned earlier, a despot, right? I remember reading somewhere that some of his officials upset him, so he had them buried in the ground up to their neck in front of everyone else and had scorpions released on them. That's kind of like pushing your point home, right? He was also known to put out the eyes of people, to have their children killed in front of them and then make them blind. And then on top of that would turn their homes into a public sewer. In fact, we'll see that next time. There's also a recorded case where he had two of his officers step out of line, so he had them roasted over a spit on an open fire. So he's an all-round nice guy. The question is, friends, is how would you have handled this situation? On one hand, to protest in the wrong way would have led to certain death and maybe even the death of your boss. But on the other hand, to simply go along would have meant compromise. But Daniel didn't compromise. He had tact and he had wisdom. Verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men, in other words, the other guys, who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. So Daniel proposed a test. 10 days out of 3 years, no time at all. Give it a try. And I think Daniel knew that it would give God an opportunity to move. If they're faithful, the idea is that God would move in their circumstance, which he does. Verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. So this idea of Daniel proposing a test which maintains the boss's integrity and in the process didn't compromise was genius, absolute genius. To these 4 young men, verse 17 continues, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And so notice in verse 17, all 4 boys prospered. They all became what I call God-appointed smart cookies. They all had God-given knowledge and wisdom. And of course, that's across the board. Ancient Babylon was known for its science, its literature, its meteorology, its architecture, its warfare, its politics, its economics, and its agricultural practices. And these boys became well skilled in all of these. But then notice how Daniel is separated out from the other 3. What does the next part of the text say? It says this, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Not the other boys, but just Daniel. And this one line, friends, is incredibly profound because it actually becomes what I call the synopsis of the book. From this point on, Daniel is called on to interpret dreams that are mind-blowing. Verse 18, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. This was the day of their big test, right? They stood before the king, prepared to answer to anything that he might ask. I'd be nervous personally. You look at what would happen if you failed. Verse 19, the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Now, magicians and enchanters, we're going to start unpacking some of that next week. But these were the king's inner circle. They were his advisors. They were also heavily involved with the occult. But these were the ones that the king would turn to for what should I do next. But these 4 Jewish young men outclassed them all. And then we learn in verse 13 that Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. 70 years up the track. There's a 70-year gap between those two. So it's interesting that Daniel was going to outlast all of the characters that we met so far. King Cyrus is the Persian king who would overthrow Babylon. Friends, the interesting thing is by default, when Cyrus turns up, Daniel's in charge of Babylon. He didn't want to be, but he is. And Cyrus turns up, and Daniel is waiting there with a text out of the book of Isaiah, which calls Cyrus by name. So when Cyrus turns up, Josephus talks about this. It's almost like Daniel's going, Cyrus, I've been waiting for you. I was told 100 years ago that you'd be here. This is for you. Cyrus is so blown away by what Daniel does that he starts the process of resettling the Jews back in their homeland, 70 years to the day. It's awesome. Now, that's through the text. Key challenges this morning. These people, these boys, they were in a foreign land, they were renamed, and yet they had amazing stewardship of their hearts, and God used them in a mighty way. So a challenge for all of us is we all struggle with things. But did you notice that within the struggle, Daniel resolved that he wasn't going to compromise? How's your resolve today? How's your resolve when you look at what's going on in the world? Are you resolved to go, no, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing no matter what? So that's kind of like the first challenge. Are there areas in your life in which you know to yourself that you compromise in? Maybe that could be a matter of prayer today. I started by talking about the Christchurch earthquakes. Friends, fault line out the back here. The reason I raised that is if we had a big earthquake today, are you just sort of going to drift into that, or have you got a pre-thought through way that you are going to guard your heart through all of that should that happen? I pray that it doesn't. But Jesus did say that there would be earthquakes in various places. I think the biggest thing for us here is that God is active in our world. You'll look at the news and you'll go, what on earth is going on? But we know that God works for the destiny of nations and for the good of individuals. And so what that means, friends, is as we gather here this morning in the hall, that we know that his Holy Spirit is with us. There's lots in chapter 1. Maybe you're struggling a little bit with your identity in Christ today. Make it a matter of prayer. Maybe your prayer just might need to be, Lord, where are you? What's going on?